Let me, before we introduce our speaker, to introduce people at the head table. For those of you who haven't met everybody, I'll start to my extreme right, and that's not politically. Dr. Dina Khouri, representing the Arab Center's Academic Advisory Board, professor at George Washington University of History. And next to her is George Salem, good friend for many years. Many of you have seen the two of us in so many different events over the past 30 plus years. George represents the board of directors of Arab Center Washington. To my extreme left, politically, no, just kidding. Dr. Marwan Kobalan, my colleague and dear friend, who came all the way from Doha, Qatar, where he serves as the researcher and as director of policy analysis at our affiliate Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, which is emerging under his leadership and other colleagues as the premier think tank in the Arab world, actually. And to my immediate left, I would like to also introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Tariq Mitri, director of the Issam Faris Center at AUB, and also member of the board of Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Doha, Qatar. Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker today is Ambassador Joan Polachek. She is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, a career Foreign Service officer with the rank of Minister Counselor. Ambassador Polaschik served most recently, 2014 to 2017. Actually, she came back to town in just two months ago. She served as U.S. Ambassador to the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria. Her career has focused on the Middle East and North Africa with assignments as Director of the State Department's Office of Egypt and Levant Affairs and Director of the Office of Israel and Palestinian Affairs. She was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli, Libya, during a very tough period of time that we are all aware of, and we appreciate her service to the country under those difficult circumstances. But she also served as Regional Refugee Coordinator based in the U.S. Embassy in Amman, Jordan, as Political Officer in Tunisia, and other staff-level assignments in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. She has served in other countries a little bit beyond the Middle East, including Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan. And Ambassador Polachek studied at the University of Virginia, one of my favorite schools, being a resident of the great Commonwealth of Virginia, and Georgetown University. She speaks Arabic and French, some Azerbaijani and Russian. Ahlan wa sahlan, soyez la bienvenue.
Shukran.
Okay. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Polachek.
Thank you, Halil.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Halil, for that very warm introduction. It's really lovely to be with all of you this afternoon. I've seen lots of old friends in the audience, including Ambassador Bougherra, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity to meet so many new friends as well. And it's a huge pleasure to speak to an audience that is so engaged and passionate about the Middle East and North Africa. Today, I'd like to give you an overview of our analysis and approach to the Middle East and North Africa, the 18 countries that comprise the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Consistent with the President's foreign policy agenda across the Middle East, we seek to protect the United States and our partners as we advance our interests in the region. Our approach is practical, principled, and realistic. We will triage the multiple threats we face and work to address each of them in sequence. We seek to stabilize and secure the region to prevent radicalization, the development of safe havens for terrorist groups, and threat projection by terrorist groups and states that sponsor terrorist groups that can reach the United States and our allies. In addressing the security and stabilization challenges that I'm about to detail for you, we actively engage through diplomacy, security cooperation, and through a robust and highly focused assistance program that supports our partnerships in the region with humanitarian, economic, and security assistance. Our total assistance budget for the region is approximately $7 billion per year. The assistance budget reflects a commitment to ensure that every dollar is aligned with our objectives and is used effectively. Assistance programs reflect the interests of the American people, including responsible stewardship of the taxpayers' money, and leverage the considerable resources of our regional partners and the broader international community. Our highest priority, indeed the President's highest priority, is the defeat of ISIS. ISIS poses a real and direct threat to the United States and our allies, having sponsored and inspired acts of terrorism across Europe and in the United States. ISIS's ability to control territory, erase international borders, raise revenue through oil sales, and develop an online presence that both attracts recruits willing to commit acts of terror in their home countries or in Iraq and Syria, and spreads their hateful ideology, made it a threat unlike any we have seen before. In its early days, ISIS spread across Syria and Iraq, taking control of oil fields and major cities like Raqqa and Mosul, threatening Baghdad, and committing unspeakable crimes in the name of religion. ISIS posed a clear and present danger to our security interests at home, in Iraq, in Syria, and across the region. We weren't alone in that assessment. Across the world, like-minded nations were appalled by the hatred and violence espoused by ISIS. That's why they joined us to form a 73-member international coalition to defeat the group. The coalition we lead has been remarkably successful, fighting by, with, and through our partners on the ground, Iraqi security forces, including the Kurdish Peshmerga, and the Syrian Democratic Forces, to drive out ISIS, liberate civilians and territory, and push ISIS to the brink of military defeat. Today, ISIS has lost approximately 90% of the territory it once controlled in Iraq and Syria combined. To date, ISIS has not reclaimed any of the over 85,000 square kilometers cleared in coalition-enabled operations. These coalition-enabled operations have freed nearly 7 million people, more than 4.4 million in Iraq, and over 2.5 million in Syria. Coalition forces have liberated major cities in Iraq and Syria, including Mosul in Iraq, and most recently, ISIS's self-declared capital of Raqqa in northern Syria. The battle for Raqqa was difficult, but our success in Raqqa shows that our approach is working. Empower and assist local forces, such as the Syrian Democratic Forces, to liberate their own communities. As a result, coalition forces have delivered a major milestone in the campaign to defeat ISIS. In Iraq, Prime Minister Abadi has been an exceptionally strong partner as we work together to expel ISIS from Iraq and reestablish Iraqi government control over all Iraqi territory. Simultaneous operations have significantly reduced ISIS's ability to move across borders and threaten coalition homelands. Coalition operations have resulted in a treasure trove of intelligence information to help better understand and counter threats from ISIS. With the end of major combat operations against ISIS on the near-term horizon, we are now facing the daunting task of immediate stabilization. ISIS has left massive destruction and devastation in its wake. As territory is liberated in Iraq, we, the coalition and the international stabilization effort led so ably by the United Nations Development Programme's Lee's Grand, have been working with the Iraqi government to clear mines and other explosive remnants of the conflict and to restore basic services like electricity, water, and sewage. It is critical that we make it possible for civilians to return to their homes and get to the work of rebuilding their lives, their cities, and their country. In Syria, a State Department-led multi-agency team comprised of civilian humanitarian and stabilization experts is now working with the Raqqa and Tabqa civilian councils, local civil society organizations, and local technocrats. This team is facilitating the delivery of humanitarian assistance, directing the removal of explosive hazards and improvised explosive devices, and prioritizing stabilization activities to help restore essential basic services. However, we must be clear about the scale of the challenges we face. It will be many months before it is safe for people to return to Raqqa to begin to rebuild the city and their lives. In both Iraq and Syria, immediate stabilization efforts help address the region's displacement crisis by creating the opportunity for refugees and IDPs to return voluntarily to safe, stable, and functional hometowns. Throughout the course of operations to militarily defeat ISIS, we are working to de-escalate the levels of violence in Syria to create the space necessary for a political process to end the violence. Once ISIS is defeated, we can then address regional stabilization. ISIS's defeat and decreased levels of violence are necessary conditions to tackle our remaining strategic priorities. The looming defeat of ISIS presents the opportunity to take advantage of new levers to end the violence in Syria. Our efforts in southwest Syria, where we agreed to a trilateral ceasefire arrangement with Russia and Jordan, have led to a significant and sustainable decrease in violence. We hope this arrangement and other genuine efforts to de-escalate violence will contribute to creating a better environment to negotiate a permanent political solution to the crisis. A sustainable and genuine political solution requires a credible political process based on the UN-sponsored intra-Syria talks in Geneva, led by UN Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura. It is our opinion that Assad is not fit to govern Syria. He has committed heinous acts of violence against his people. While the United States can potentially influence the future governance of Syria, it is up to the Syrian people themselves to decide their future through a legitimate and inclusive political process owned and led by Syrians themselves. Russia, which intervened to save the Assad regime in 2015, should understand that the Assad regime bears enormous responsibility for the turmoil and suffering afflicting the Syrian people. The Russians want to paint the current state of affairs in Syria as a victory. We do not view Assad and his partners' destruction of Syria as a victory. Syria, Russia, and Iran want significant reconstruction aid for Syria from the West. They cannot afford to rebuild Syria on their own. We will not provide reconstruction money unless and until there is a credible political process to settle Syria's future. We have no preconditions on the process other than it be a credible process. We will press Russia and the Assad regime to demonstrate their commitment to lasting stability by acknowledging the necessity and desirability of a credible political process. 2 weeks ago, the President announced his decision to decline to provide a certification to Congress under the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, or INARA. However, to be clear, as Secretary Tillerson has said, it remains our intent to stay in the JCPOA if we can address the serious flaws of the deal. The President's decision is based upon the requirements of INARA, which is domestic legislation. Under INARA, one of the important criteria we have to judge is that the sanctions relief provided under the JCPOA is proportionate to Iran's efforts and activities to limit its nuclear program. Now that we've completed our review of Iran policy, the President has come to the conclusion that he cannot certify under INARA that the sanctions relief that was provided is proportionate, in effect, to the benefit that we're seeing from the nuclear deal. The President's decision set in motion a process in Congress to determine where we go next. President has directed the administration to work with our allies and with Congress to fix the JCPOA's sunset clause, bolster enforcement of the deal, and correct its omission of constraints on ICBMs that could threaten the homeland. While we work with Congress to fix our legislation and help strengthen the deal, we will continue to implement our sanctions relief commitments and hold Iran strictly accountable to its JCPOA nuclear-related commitments. As Secretary Tillerson has stressed, we don't think that the nuclear deal should define the entire policy toward Iran. We also need to acknowledge and counter Iran's destabilizing influence. Iran has capitalized on the instability created by ISIS across the region, particularly in Syria and Iraq. Iran is not just a regional threat, but a global challenge confronting all of us, the United States, along with our partners in the region and across the world. Beyond its nuclear program, Iran is developing a ballistic missile capability in defiance of UN Security Council resolutions. Iran is supporting terrorist groups across the region with weapons and other material assistance. Iran's support for the Assad regime, which has committed numerous atrocities in Syria, and for the terrorist group Hezbollah, is a significant threat to our interests and our allies, including Israel. And Iran is exploiting divisions, supporting proxies who extend and exacerbate civil conflicts, tearing countries apart. We will look to contain, constrain, and roll back Iranian influence throughout the region. It is in the United States' interest and the Iraqi people's interest for Iraq to exercise its sovereignty and independence to the fullest extent. Iraq is not now, nor should it ever be, another nation's proxy. That is why we stand shoulder to shoulder with Iraq on the foundation of our Strategic Framework Agreement to help Iraqis build their institutional capacity, politically, economically, and in providing for their own national security while fully respecting Iraqi sovereignty. We are also eager to continue helping Iraq build and reform its economy to rebuild after years of conflict. And we are helping to cement Baghdad's important and natural relationships with the Arab world, the Gulf, Europe, and Western financial institutions. Secretary Tillerson's participation in the Iraq-Saudi Bilateral Coordination Council earlier this week reflects the importance we place on helping Iraq build stronger ties with Saudi Arabia. Already, the Iraqi-Saudi border has been reopened, direct air links have resumed after 26 years, and Saudi Arabia is exploring investment opportunities in Iraq that will help with much-needed Iraqi economic development. Prime Minister Abadi has been a stalwart ally. He offers a forward-looking vision of an inclusive Iraq, and he puts Iraq's national interests first. We will continue to support his agenda. In the aftermath of the Iraqi Kurds' independence referendum, we are focused on shoring up Iraq's unity and the stability of the Iraqi Kurdistan region while pushing back on Iran's malign influence in Iraq. The Iraqi Kurds held their September 25th independence referendum over the objections of the United States and the international community, and we are now working to help contain the fallout. We oppose the referendum as unconstitutional, as harmful to the cooperation needed in the fight against ISIS, and as a threat to spark violence, especially in Iraq's disputed internal areas. Sporadic fighting has erupted between the Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga forces, but fortunately, large-scale violence, so far, has been avoided. We are now pressing Prime Minister Abadi not to overplay his hand by entering the recognized territory of the Iraqi Kurdistan region. To mitigate the risk of violence, we are engaging Iraqi and Kurdish officials to help them establish joint security mechanisms in disputed areas. These mechanisms will help both sides communicate clearly and reduce the chance that misunderstandings between them will spark violence. Ultimately, we view a united Iraq as the strongest Iraq, and we continue to urge both Baghdad and Erbil to forge peaceful solutions to their differences through dialogue. We stand ready to help mediate this process. As we have seen elsewhere in the Middle East, Iran is ready to exploit any instability to enhance its own influence. It is already attempting to do so in this situation, so we must work to shore up Iraq's unity and push back on Iran. The continued rift among the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, with some states levying sanctions upon and closing their borders with their neighbor Qatar, opens the door to increased Iranian influence and is a distraction from our efforts to address real crises, including in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. The GCC structure is a source of stability and provides the United States with a framework with which to organize our economic, military, counterterrorism, and diplomatic engagements with our Gulf partners. We regret to see these fractures emerge among our friends. As the dispute drags on, the parties' ability to collaborate deteriorates. A dysfunctional GCC reduces the region's ability to apprehend and respond to emergent external challenges. General Anthony Zinni, who has deep experience in the region and has lent his support to our efforts to resolve the dispute, reminded us that the GCC's military command structures were essential to the international coalition's success more than a quarter century ago during Operation Desert Storm. The Gulf's ability to confront its external threats with a united front is degraded by its infighting. Though we have seen little progress toward a resolution, we continue to believe that positive engagement remains the most productive path. Secretary Tillerson was in Riyadh and Doha earlier this week, urging the GCC to engage in dialogue. As the Secretary said, it is very important for the GCC to continue to pursue unity. We've seen some progress, such as the implementation of a comprehensive MOU on counterterrorism cooperation with Qatar that Secretary Tillerson signed on an earlier trip, and which represents a major step forward. All these states are and will remain our partners. We are engaging with all sides, and we support Kuwait's mediation effort. Further south, the conflict in Yemen is a humanitarian tragedy. Yemenis struggle to find enough food on a daily basis and have suffered through the world's worst cholera outbreaks in recent times. Nearly 857,000 suspected cases of cholera as of this week, and more than 2,100 deaths. This fractured environment, the result of a former dictator and Iranian-backed Houthis forming an alliance of convenience to upset and upend a peaceful transition of power, has created openings that Iran and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula have exploited to expand their influence. Iran has used this opportunity to send sophisticated weapons to the Houthis. These weapons, including missiles the Houthis have launched at Saudi Arabia and at ships in the strategic Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the southern Red Sea, have become a serious threat. We are working to address Yemen's humanitarian tragedy, providing nearly $638 million in humanitarian assistance over the past year. This is twice the amount we provided last year. By working with the UN's World Food Program and other partners, we have reached millions of food insecure beneficiaries with food distributions or cash vouchers. We've also supported cholera treatment centers and public messaging on water, sanitation, and hygiene best practices. We urge all sides in the conflict to allow unfettered access for shipments of humanitarian aid and commercial supplies, including food, fuel, and medicine to all Yemenis. In addition, we are leveraging our non-humanitarian assistance resources with those of other donors in support of a stabilization and recovery plan that aims to revive responsive local government, basic services, productive activity, commerce, and employment in the country, helping Yemenis rise out from the grips of income and food insecurity. Recognizing that these efforts will succeed only if there is a lasting cessation of hostilities, it is time for all parties to join in a political resolution. We support the work of UN Envoy Ismail Ould Sheikh Ahmed and encourage all sides to work through the UN building a political framework for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Taken together, our work to resolve these regional conflicts helps us stabilize the region, contain threats to the United States, and close opportunities for Iran to expand its influence. In Libya, we have a window of opportunity that leaves me cautiously hopeful. And as a longtime realist about the region, that's about as optimistic as I ever get. Working with our international partners in support of the United Nations Support Mission in Libya and UN Special Representative Ghassan Salameh, we have an opportunity to advance a pragmatic plan for a political solution. The circumstances are relatively favorable for such a resolution. No party can achieve a military victory without provoking chaos, and all need stability so that oil can continue to flow and everyone can get paid. The international community and our regional partners also have a common interest in promoting stability, and the only credible path to that goal is to unite around one plan. Salameh's plan is a political framework that supports a more unified national government capable of delivering support, services, and security to the people of Libya that, in partnership with the international community, can defeat ISIS and other terrorists and counter transnational flows of irregular migrants and illicit arms. There is more work to be done, but a political solution ending the conflict in Libya is a more realistic possibility than it has been in the past several years. Turning to an issue that has been our focus for many years, let me say a few words about our efforts to forge peace between Israel and the Palestinians. The President has been clear that achieving a comprehensive and lasting peace agreement is a priority for this administration, and we are intensively engaged in efforts to bring the parties to the table to resolve the conflict. Addressing the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians allows us to improve regional stability and deny an opening for radicals to exploit. We are closely following the ongoing reconciliation discussions between Fatah and Hamas. As the President's Special Representative Jason Greenblatt has said, we welcome efforts to create the conditions for the Palestinian Authority to fully assume its responsibilities in Gaza. However, any legitimate Palestinian government must unambiguously and explicitly commit to nonviolence and peaceful negotiations, recognize the State of Israel, and accept previous agreements and obligations between the parties. On this, the United States, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority all agree. The President remains optimistic that progress can be made. There are likely to be a lot of ups and downs on the way to peace, and progress toward a comprehensive deal will take time. We must ensure that we're all prioritizing peace, and spoilers are not given the opportunity to jeopardize progress. Finally, I'd like to end by taking a step back to look at the profound challenges facing the region, the sort of meta issues. Day to day, our focus is on ISIS, Iran, Syria, Yemen, and Libya, the current source of threats to the United States, our interests, and our partners. But taking a broader look at the region as a whole, the threats we see today are largely symbols of decades of dysfunctional political systems that failed to address the long-term socioeconomic pressures facing the region. Years of neglect from political systems that served elites, not the people, have taken a toll. The region faces a youth bulge, a booming population, with millions now entering the workforce. Let's look, for example, at Egypt. In 2000, Egypt had 66 million people. Today, Egypt has over 93 million people. They've added 27 million people in the past 17 years. Across the region, states struggle to provide basic services to their growing populations and jobs to millions of youth looking to start their lives. Over time, the biggest threat to regional stability and security will be the ability of governments to deal with these socioeconomic pressures. Terrorism and radicalization only exacerbate this tremendous challenge. Now, the United States can only do so much. We offer assistance to partners who are willing to make necessary reforms to spur economic growth and job creation. We continue to support reforms to unlock greater economic opportunity, increase transparency, and improve the delivery of basic services. We encourage all of our partners in the region to provide their citizens with a positive vision of hope, opportunity, and prosperity. In Tunisia, a series of open and fair elections and political parties working together have produced a peaceful transition of power and a government promising to deliver a better future for its citizens. And in Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince has rolled out a series of reforms to open up both the Saudi economy through his Vision 2030 plan to diversify the economy, as well as Saudi society for, by example, finally allowing women to drive. The United States cannot fix the Middle East, but we stand ready to work with our partners who have the courage and leadership to address the challenges I've outlined. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Khalil, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
I'd like to ask staff, if you could, please collect the questions. And thank you, Ambassador, for presenting this American perspective of the challenges we face in the Middle East today. Let me start with basically several of our speakers this morning referred to their perception that the administration's policy in the region lacked some clear priorities and objectives in the Arab world. How would you respond to that?
Well, I hope my speech answered that question.
I hope so.
I think we do have clear priorities, and I remember when I was sitting out in Algeria back in late January, trying to figure out what exactly our new administration was doing, and I checked out the White House website, and the top foreign policy priorities, number one, defeating ISIS, defeating terrorism. That's still very much as a focus, as you could tell from my remarks. Countering Iran also is a very, very important focus for us. But I think also we can't forget, in the midst of all these urgent crises of every day, to look at those longer term trends. And I was delighted to hear about some of the topics of discussion from this morning, that you as a group are looking at those big issues, because we're living in the midst of really challenging times. So I think as we're focused on defeating terrorism and dealing with all these security threats, we can't lose sight of the fact that the region is undergoing such profound change, because engaging today's youth in a very constructive and productive way, ensuring that they have the tools that they need to succeed, is going to be key to ensuring everyone's long-term prosperity.
All right, we have a question from Barbara Slavin, Atlantic Council. How would you define a, quote, credible political process, end of quote, in Syria, and particularly if Iran continues to play a part, or can Iran continue to play a part in that process?
Okay, that's a really good question. And I think for the first, now how many months? 9 months of the administration, we've been very focused on working to just decrease the levels of violence. And I like to think that we've been successful because with these deconfliction zones, the various ceasefires, at least we're bringing down the level of suffering of the Syrian people. And it's very hard to see how there can be a credible political process when people are struggling so mightily as they have been. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we're getting in a better place now in late 2017 than we were a few years ago, because as the level of violence decreases, hopefully we can work on building that political process. Secretary Tillerson was in Geneva briefly today, and he met with Staffan de Mistura to talk about the political process. And I understand that Staffan de Mistura will be briefing the Security Council today. Maybe that's even ongoing right now. So the thinking is that we would like to see a revival of the Geneva process. And the Astana process is ongoing. That is not a political process. I want to be sure that everyone understands that, because I think that some of the other people involved in that process, namely the Russians and the Iranians, would like to see the Astana process become a political process. It is not. A political process must be a Geneva process. And we're putting our heads together and thinking about what that might look like, and stay tuned.
Greg Aftandilian, where is the funding for the heavily damaged cities in Iraq and Syria going to come from? what is the role of the U.S. in this endeavor?
I think President Trump has been very clear that the United States is no longer in the business of nation building. He made those remarks in the context of, I believe, his South Asia policy. Iraq is a country that has resources, but the needs are also great. So it's kind of a two-track approach that we're looking at. One, we are working very hard with the Iraqis to encourage them to open up and reform their economy. They could do a number of things that would attract more foreign investment, create jobs, promote growth. That in and of itself probably won't be enough. So on the second track, we're working with the members of the de-ISIS coalition to do fundraising. We have what we like to call the Tin Cup exercise. We've been sending instructions out to our embassies to engage their host governments. The Kuwaitis have very generously offered to host an Iraq reconstruction conference coming up early in the new year, I believe the January-February timeframe. So we're hoping that people will be responsive to that. But it has to be a two-track approach. It can't be the United States alone. It can't be the major economies of the world alone. It has to be everyone, all of our partners contributing. It also really has to be the Iraqi people themselves, and they've got to do more to open up and reform their economy.
There are two questions regarding the situation in Yemen. Phyllis Bennis and Steve Fake ask, in light of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, are there any conditions at all under which the U.S. will stop refueling Saudi fighter jets that are bombing Yemen? And Phyllis asks, U.S. food aid to Yemen is useless while the war continues, especially the bombing of civilians and through the participation of even direct participation by the U.S. Air Force flying in-air refueling missions to help with that. What's your response to those two issues regarding Yemen?
Well, as a former U.S. refugee coordinator, I take strong objection to that last point. The idea that it's futile to provide humanitarian assistance to people who are suffering, I just don't understand. I think we have an obligation, and the United States has always been the world's leader in providing humanitarian assistance. You all follow these issues very well. You know that we generally meet our obligation of 20% of any humanitarian appeal, and I have seen no indication that this administration is changing that. We believe strongly that everyone needs help, and we will continue to do so. So yes, there's tremendous value added in providing humanitarian assistance and food aid. I hope that you wouldn't prefer to see that people suffer. I mean, they're already suffering. Why would we not do what we can to make their lives better? With regard to the first question about a political process, we have been very engaged. One aspect of Secretary Tillerson's trip that really hasn't been in the news has been the fact that he has been engaging with his Saudi counterparts on the Yemen issue. My boss, Ambassador David Satterfield, actually went out to the region in advance of Secretary Tillerson's trip so that he could have his own very focused discussions with counterparts about the crisis in Yemen. The British government is also very concerned about the situation and has been trying hard to organize more of a process. We have these meetings that we call the Quad and the Quint and various mechanisms. So we're looking at holding some more of those meetings coming up, potentially in November, and it's a priority for us. We're very, very concerned, and I think those of you who follow these issues have seen that there's increasing concern from the Hill as well. So the humanitarian angles are really important, and I think that in and of itself, the crisis is adding more impetus to find the political solution.
Marina Ottaway from the Wilson Center, from 1 to 10, she's gonna make it easy for you, just okay. Quantified. From 1 to 10, how do you rate US influence on the Iraq government, on Kurdistan, on the PMF, and how do you rate Iranian influence on the same?
Oh, well, I'm going to decline to provide a numeric rating. Diplomats don't like to do things like that. We prefer the squishy gray answers. Yes, the US is an important partner for Iraq, and for Iraq, the United States is an important partner. The US is an important partner for the Kurds. The Kurds are an important partner for the United States. And I don't think you can look at this question as being exclusive, right? You can't look at Iraq without the Kurds, and you can't look at the Kurds without Iraq. So I would just stress the point that I made in my remarks. we're really engaged in trying to find a solution. The Kurdish authorities went ahead with this referendum very much against our council. And now we're trying to work very hard with all the parties to make sure that Iraq emerges from this crisis intact. We respect Iraqi sovereignty, and we certainly hope that all the other players in the region do so as well.
The next question focuses on the State Department budget, particularly cuts with regards to, for example, assistance to Tunisia. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, I think you've all seen the budget that was put forward by this administration. We are not a unicameral system of government, so there is an ongoing debate between the administration and the Congress certainly has its own views. So at the end of the day, I'm not quite sure where we're going to come down on this. But I will say that Tunisia is an incredibly important partner for the United States. As I noted in my remarks, it's also one of the bright spots of what has been a very turbulent, now almost 7 years in the region. So I think it's important for all of us that Tunisia's transition continue to succeed. Money is not always the answer, by the way, when you look at foreign assistance. Sometimes it's needed for very specific uses. Sometimes recipient countries don't necessarily have the capacity to deal with all of it. So I would encourage all of you, to, first of all, keep an open mind. The jury is still not out yet because the debate is still ongoing about the foreign assistance budget. But also there are many, many ways in which the United States can be a strong partner without necessarily using a lot of cash. Because there are times, for example, where assistance programs that are more focused on training and not necessarily equipping, providing the expertise that's needed to help a country navigate tough issues where other countries pick up the tab. There are always many ways to skin a cat, as the saying goes.
All right, time is intruding again. I would like to conclude with this question, although there are quite a few other questions that we haven't gotten to yet. But Mohammed Sharqawi, George Mason University, research has shown that $1 invested in peacemaking saves $16 in war costs. How do you understand this finding as a diplomat?
As a diplomat, I agree. And I think that all of the U.S. military leadership would agree with that. How many times have you all heard generals say, "I would love nothing more than to be put out of business"? And so it's tough times. There's times where we need to all be creative and think about ways that we can work together to find solutions to these huge challenges. And I would just like to, again, salute all of you for your participation in these efforts. From what I heard about the discussion this morning, there's a lot of really great thinking going on out there. And having dialogue, trying to come up with different perspectives, different solutions is really essential to the work that I'm doing every day. So thank you for this opportunity to come and chat with you.
Thank you, Ambassador Polaschik, for visiting with us today and for your presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending the conference and particularly this event. Thank you.